It was late in the afternoon when the officer began his routine drive along the highway. The sky was slowly changing its color, with the sun sinking lower behind the distant buildings. The road was not too busy, just a few cars passing by every now and then. It was one of those regular patrols that often ended quietly, with nothing much happening. But this time something caught his eye, something small yet strong enough to stir his instincts. Ahead of him, a car was moving in a strange way. It wasn't speeding, but the wheels seemed to swerve slightly, almost as if the driver wasn't fully in control. At first, the officer thought maybe the person behind the wheel was just tired or distracted. But when the car drifted too close to the shoulder before correcting itself, his suspicion grew. He had been on the job long enough to know that sometimes what looked minor could be a sign of something bigger. He slowed his own car and kept a safe distance as he observed. The car was old, a little scratched on the side, and its taillight flickered as though it was faulty. But it wasn't the condition of the car that made him uneasy. It was the way the driver seemed tense, the way the hands on the wheel gripped too tightly. He decided it was enough reason to pull the car over. Switching on his siren, he signaled for the driver to move to the side of the road. The car hesitated for a few seconds, almost as if the driver was deciding whether to stop or not. Then finally it slowed and pulled onto the shoulder. The officer parked his patrol car a short distance behind and stepped out. He adjusted his belt, took a calm breath, and began walking forward. He had done this hundreds of times before, but something about this one felt different. As he got closer, he could see the driver's profile through the window. The man looked stiff, keeping his face straight ahead instead of glancing at the officer like most drivers usually did. That in itself was unusual. Most people at least tried to appear polite or nervous, but this driver seemed determined not to make any connection. The officer tapped gently on the glass, and after a moment, the window rolled down. The driver forced a small smile, but his eyes told a different story. They darted left and right, as if searching for something or calculating a way out. The officer greeted him in a steady voice and asked the usual questions: license, registration, where he was headed. The man's hands trembled slightly as he passed over the documents. His voice, though calm on the surface, carried an edge that didn't sit right. As the officer listened, his gaze shifted to the back seat. At first it seemed empty, but then he noticed a figure sitting quietly, pressed against the corner of the seat. It was a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She sat so still that he almost missed her presence. Her hair was messy, her clothes looked crumpled, and her eyes were the kind that made his stomach tighten, wide, silent, and filled with something no child should carry: fear. He glanced back at the driver. "Is that your daughter?" he asked casually, as if it were just part of the routine. The man nodded quickly, too quickly, and said yes. But he didn't turn back to look at the girl, didn't speak to her the way a parent usually would when a child was around. The officer found that odd. Normally, children during traffic stops either fidget, whisper questions, or look at the officer with curiosity. This girl did none of that. She sat frozen, her small hands resting tensely on her lap. The officer leaned slightly closer, pretending to check the inside of the car. He noticed the girl's wrist as she moved her hand slightly. It carried a faint mark, like a bruise or a tightly pressed line from something that had been binding her. His heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression calm. The last thing he wanted was to alert the driver that he had noticed. Inside, though, his mind was racing. Something wasn't right. Everything about this scene was wrong. The driver's nervousness, the girl's silence, the uneasy air that hung between them. He decided to keep the conversation going, to buy himself time and see if he could draw out more information. He asked the driver where they were coming from. The answer came quickly, but when he asked again later, the man gave a different version without realizing it. That was another red flag. The officer nodded as though he believed him, but deep down he knew the man was hiding something. He turned slightly, letting his eyes meet the little girl's. For a split second, their gaze locked. She didn't speak, but her eyes told a story louder than words. It was as though she was silently begging him to notice her, to help her. His chest tightened. He had seen many difficult things in his career, but there was something haunting about the way this child sat there, trapped in silence. Carefully, he stepped back and spoke to the driver again, pretending to check over the documents more thoroughly. With one hand resting on his radio, he sent a subtle signal to his station for backup. He couldn't act too quickly, not without putting the child in more danger. He needed support, and he needed to handle this in a way that would not alarm the driver into doing something reckless. The air felt heavier now. The noise of passing cars seemed distant, drowned by the pounding of his own heartbeat. Every second stretched longer as he stood there, keeping his voice calm, asking questions that sounded ordinary, but were carefully chosen to measure the driver's reactions. The man grew more uneasy with every moment. He kept glancing at the mirror as though checking how much time had passed. The girl didn't move, didn't blink much, but her small shoulders rose and fell with shallow breaths. The officer knew she was scared, and he felt the weight of responsibility pressing hard against him. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Finally, he caught sight of flashing lights in the distance. Backup was on its way. He forced himself to stay composed, continuing the conversation, waiting for the right moment. Inside his mind, a storm was building. He had stopped this car thinking it might be a simple case of careless driving, but what he found instead was something far darker, something that could not be ignored. The look on the little girl's face was burned into him, and he knew he couldn't walk away from it. The moment the backup arrived would change everything, and though he didn't yet know the full truth, his instincts told him one thing clearly: the child in the back seat was not safe, and it was up to him to make sure she would be. That knowledge sent a chill down his spine, a chill that made his face turn pale as he looked once more at the little girl who sat quietly, holding her breath in the back seat of that car. The officer kept his tone calm as he continued speaking with the driver, but inside he was fighting the heavy feeling that something was terribly wrong. The child in the back seat wasn't acting like any ordinary passenger. She was too still, too quiet, and her eyes carried that silent cry for help he could not ignore. Yet he had to play it carefully, because one wrong move could put her at risk. He stepped back slightly, pretending to check the license and registration against his notes, giving himself time to think. He kept one eye on the driver and the other on the little girl. Every time their eyes met, even for a brief second, he could feel the weight of her fear. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her silence was loud enough for him to hear. The driver cleared his throat and asked if there was a problem. His voice sounded forced, too polite for the tension in his face. The officer replied in his usual steady way, saying he just needed to check a few things. He didn't want to let the driver sense his suspicion. If the man realized he had been caught, there was no telling what he might do. Minutes stretched on like hours. The officer knew backup was close, but not close enough yet. He had to keep this man occupied until help arrived. He decided to test the driver with questions that seemed casual but carried hidden weight. "Where are you heading this evening?" he asked. The driver answered quickly, saying he was going to visit family. The officer nodded, pretending to be satisfied. A few moments later, he circled back to the same question in a slightly different way. This time the man gave a different answer. He mentioned meeting a friend in another town. The inconsistency stood out like a warning bell. The officer kept his expression neutral, but his suspicion grew stronger. He leaned forward slightly, glancing at the girl again. "And that's your daughter?" he asked once more, this time in a more natural, conversational tone. The man nodded too fast and forced a smile, but still he never turned to look at the child or try to comfort her. That, to the officer, was one of the biggest signs that this was not a parent-child relationship. Parents almost always reassure their children in stressful moments, but here there was nothing. No touch, no words, no glance. The girl finally shifted just slightly, and the officer noticed the way she held her hands close to her body. Her wrists carried faint marks, as if she had been bound or gripped tightly not long ago. It made his chest tighten. He wanted to ask her something, to give her a chance to speak, but he knew the risk. If he pressured her now, the driver might panic. So he kept talking to the man, asking him to step out of the vehicle under the excuse of clarifying some details. The driver hesitated, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. For a moment, the officer thought he might refuse, but after a tense pause, the man opened the door and stepped out. Standing outside the car, the driver's body language spoke volumes. He avoided eye contact, shifted from one foot to the other, and gave answers that sounded rehearsed. The officer kept him engaged, calmly writing notes on his pad while sneaking quick glances toward the child. Then, something subtle happened. The girl's eyes flicked toward the officer, then toward the door, as if she was trying to signal something without words. The officer understood instantly she wanted out, but she was too scared to act. His heart pounded harder, but his training reminded him to stay composed. He continued his conversation with the driver, nodding and pretending to be absorbed in paperwork. All the while, he was waiting for those backup lights to appear on the horizon. Finally, faint but steady, he saw them in his mirror, another patrol car making its way toward them. Relief washed through him, but he couldn't let it show. He needed the driver calm until help was right there. He cleared his throat and asked another simple question. "What's the girl's name?" The man froze for a moment. It was quick, but the officer noticed. The driver gave an answer, but the name slipped out awkwardly as though he had to think of it on the spot. The officer repeated the name back, as if confirming it, and turned to glance at the child. She didn't react, didn't even nod, as though she had never heard that name before in her life. That moment confirmed everything he had been feeling since the stop began. The officer felt a shiver run through him, his face pale as he looked back at the girl. There was no doubt now she wasn't safe, and this man wasn't who he claimed to be. By the time the backup car pulled in behind his, lights flashing softly, the officer knew the situation was about to reach a turning point. He forced himself to keep his voice steady, but inside his heart was thundering. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl's silent eyes, the marks on her wrists, and the quiet way she seemed to be asking for help without speaking a single word. The arrival of backup brought a small sense of security, but the danger hadn't passed yet. The driver noticed the flashing lights and his body stiffened. His eyes darted around as though looking for an escape. The officer tightened his grip on his notes, ready for whatever might happen next. He knew the truth was close to being revealed, and once it was, everything about this ordinary traffic stop would change forever. The backup car pulled in behind the patrol vehicle, its lights flashing softly in the fading daylight. The officer felt a wave of relief, though he didn't allow it to show. He knew the driver was already on edge, and any sudden change in expression might trigger something dangerous. The second officer stepped out of his vehicle, walking toward them in a steady, calm manner. The first officer gave a small nod, signaling silently that this wasn't a routine stop. The backup officer picked up on it immediately. Years of working together had taught them to read each other's smallest cues. The driver's posture changed the moment he saw the second officer. His shoulders stiffened, his breathing grew heavier, and his eyes flickered nervously between the two men. He shifted slightly as though he was ready to bolt, but he knew he had nowhere to go. The first officer kept his voice even. "Sir, we just need to clear up a few details before we let you go. Do you mind stepping to the back of your vehicle for a quick conversation?" The man hesitated. His lips pressed tightly together as if he was weighing his options. Finally, with a forced smile, he agreed. He stepped slowly out of the car, shutting the door a little too carefully behind him. While the second officer engaged the driver in conversation, the first officer took the opportunity to crouch slightly, looking through the window at the little girl again. She hadn't moved. Her tiny frame was stiff, her hand still locked in her lap. He offered her a soft look, hoping to reassure her without alarming the driver. He tapped the window gently. The girl's eyes flicked toward him, and this time she blinked twice in quick succession, almost like she was trying to communicate something without words. It made his heart ache. She was too young to carry such fear, too young to sit in silence when every part of her being wanted to cry out. The officer whispered softly through the glass, just loud enough for her to hear. "You're safe. Just hold on." Her lips trembled, but she didn't speak. Still, he could see a tiny shift in her expression, a spark of hope, faint but real. Meanwhile, the second officer was gently pressing the driver with questions. "Where are you coming from? And what town are you heading to?" The driver stumbled again, offering details that didn't line up with what he had said earlier. His answers grew shorter, his tone sharper. Sweat formed along his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Do you mind if we ask the child a couple of questions?" the second officer said. His words were polite, but his eyes were sharp. The driver immediately objected. "She's shy. She doesn't like strangers." His words came out too quickly, too defensive. That was the final sign both officers needed. They exchanged a look, wordless but certain. The first officer walked back toward the car, opening the back door carefully. The driver took a step forward as if to stop him, but the second officer blocked his path. The moment the door opened, the little girl's eyes filled with tears. She looked up at the officer with a mixture of fear and relief. He crouched down to her level, speaking gently. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" There was a long pause, the kind that felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Then in the softest voice, the girl whispered a name. It wasn't the name the driver had given earlier. The officer's heart sank and hardened at the same time. That single word was enough to confirm the truth. The second officer moved swiftly, placing the driver in handcuffs before he could react. The man tried to protest, shouting that there had been a mistake, but the words sounded hollow. The girl's trembling voice had told the real story, and nothing could cover that up now. As the driver was secured, the first officer gently reached for the girl's hand. She flinched at first, but then, after a hesitant moment, she let her small fingers curl around his. "You're safe now," he told her softly. His voice was steady, but inside, emotion weighed heavy. He knew she had gone through something no child ever should. Other officers soon arrived, responding to the call for backup. The scene grew busier, flashing lights reflecting off the cars, radios buzzing with updates, voices coordinating the next steps. But amid all the noise, the officer kept his focus on the girl. He guided her out of the car carefully, making sure she didn't feel rushed or scared. She clung to his hand tightly, as if afraid that letting go would make everything collapse again. Her small body trembled, but now she wasn't alone. One of the officers brought a blanket from the patrol car and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. She held onto it, pulling it close as though trying to hide inside its warmth. For the first time since he had seen her, the officer noticed her breathing start to slow, no longer shallow and frantic, but steadier, more controlled. As the driver was placed into the back of a patrol car, still shouting and denying everything, the officer chose not to focus on him. His eyes stayed on the girl, who now leaned slightly against his side as if drawing strength from his presence. The night had grown darker, the road quieter. What began as a routine stop had turned into something far greater. The officer thought about how easily this moment could have slipped past. If he had ignored his instincts, if he had treated it as just another careless driver, the outcome could have been unthinkable. He looked down at the little girl. She was exhausted, but she was safe, and that was all that mattered to him in that moment. Still, he knew this was only the beginning. Questions would have to be asked, the girl's family found, the truth uncovered fully, but for now she was no longer in danger. The officer tightened his hold on her small hand and whispered again, "You're safe now." And for the first time, he saw her nod ever so slightly, as if she was finally beginning to believe it. The man who had been driving the car was now locked in the back of the patrol vehicle. He shouted, tried to twist free, and claimed loudly that everyone was making a mistake, but no one paid attention to his words anymore. The moment the little girl had spoken, the truth became clear, and nothing he said could erase it. His voice faded into the background noise, nothing more than a distant echo of desperation. The officers focused on the child. She was wrapped in a warm blanket, her small hands clutching it tightly as if it were the only thing keeping her safe. The first officer crouched down to her level again. His voice was soft, slow, and careful, the way you would speak to someone who had already been through more than enough. "Do you know where your family is?" he asked. The little girl shook her head slowly, her lips trembling. She looked down at the ground, unable to hold his gaze. It was clear she was exhausted, frightened, and unsure if she could trust her own voice. The officer didn't push her. Instead, he nodded gently and said, "That's okay. We'll figure it out together. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Other officers began to check the car the man had been driving. They searched the trunk, the back seat, every corner inside. There were a few belongings tossed around, none of which looked like they belonged to a child. The findings only confirmed what the first officer already knew in his heart. This man had no real connection to the girl. She didn't belong in that car, and she certainly didn't belong with him. An officer on the radio received an update from the station. A child matching her description had been reported missing earlier that day. The words hit everyone hard. The case wasn't random, it was real, and this girl's family had already been desperately searching for her. The first officer looked at her again, his heart tightening. He thought of how her parents must be feeling right now, not knowing where she was, fearing the worst. He crouched down once more and said softly, "Your family is looking for you. They're waiting for you. We're going to take you to them." For the first time, her eyes lifted, meeting his. They were still filled with fear, but also with something else now. Hope. She didn't smile. Not yet. but the faint spark in her eyes was enough to keep the officer steady. They guided her gently into the patrol car, seating her in the front so she wouldn't have to see the man in the back. She sat quietly, still clutching the blanket. The first officer drove, keeping his tone light as he spoke to her now and then. He asked simple questions, not to interrogate, but to help her feel less alone. "Do you like animals?" he asked at one point, his eyes flicking toward her in the mirror. She nodded faintly. "Cats," she whispered. The word was small, almost lost in the hum of the car, but it was the first voluntary thing she had said. The officer smiled softly. "Cats are wonderful. My neighbor has one, always waiting by the window when I get home." The girl didn't answer, but for a moment her gaze softened. It was a small step, but an important one. At the station, officers had already prepared a quiet room for her, away from the noise and bustle. They offered her water, a sandwich, and a stuffed toy that someone kept in the office for times like these. She clutched the toy close, holding it with both hands as if it was a lifeline. The first officer stayed nearby, never leaving her side. She seemed to notice because whenever her eyes flicked nervously around the room, they always came back to him. His presence was the only steady thing she could hold on to. Meanwhile, the man who had been driving was processed by the other officers. He was no longer shouting, just sitting in silence, his face hard and expressionless. Whatever his plans had been, they were over now. He was under arrest, and there was no way out. The hours passed slowly, filled with paperwork, phone calls, and coordination. Every detail had to be handled carefully. But the most important call came at last. The girl's parents had been located. They were on their way to the station. When the officer heard this, he felt a wave of relief so strong that he had to take a quiet breath. He looked over at the little girl, still sitting quietly with the stuffed toy in her lap. "Your family's coming," he told her softly. Her eyes widened. "Really?" she asked, her voice trembling between disbelief and hope. "Really?" he said with certainty. "They're coming right now." For the first time, a tiny smile flickered across her face. It was small, fragile, but it was there. And for the officer, that single smile meant everything. The wait for her parents felt like forever, though it was only an hour. The girl sat quietly, her blanket still around her shoulders, the stuffed toy clutched tightly. She didn't ask questions, didn't speak much, but she looked calmer than before. Every now and then she glanced at the door, her eyes filled with anticipation. Finally, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hall. The officer turned, and before he could even speak, the door opened. A woman rushed inside, followed closely by a man. Their faces were wet with tears, their voices breaking as they called out her name. The girl froze for a moment, as if her mind couldn't believe what her eyes were seeing. Then in a sudden burst, she ran forward, dropping the stuffed toy and blanket, and threw herself into her mother's arms. The woman held her tight, sobbing into her hair, while the father wrapped both of them in his arms. The room filled with cries, relief, and the kind of love that words could never truly describe. The officer stood back quietly, giving them space. His chest felt heavy, but this time in a good way. This was the moment he had been working toward since the traffic stop began. This was the reason his instincts mattered, the reason he had trusted that uneasy feeling in his gut. The reunion was long, filled with tears, kisses, and whispered promises. The girl clung to her parents, refusing to let go, and they held her just as tightly, as though afraid she might disappear again. Finally, after what felt like forever, the mother turned, her eyes meeting the officer's. She tried to speak, but words failed her. All she could do was mouth a quiet, heartfelt thank you. The officer gave a small nod, not trusting his own voice either. The man who had taken the girl sat locked away in a cell now, his presence irrelevant to the joy filling the room. The focus was where it belonged, on the child, safe again in her parents' arms. The officer left them to their reunion, stepping outside for a moment of fresh air. The night sky stretched above him, stars scattered across the darkness. He let out a long breath, the weight of the evening finally lifting from his shoulders. It had started as an ordinary patrol, just another evening on the job. But tonight had been anything but ordinary. Tonight his instincts had led him to a child who needed saving, and because of that a family was whole again. As he stood there in the quiet night, he knew this was a moment he would never forget. Some calls fade with time, but this one would stay with him forever, not because of the danger but because of the look in a little girl's eyes when she finally realized she was safe. The reunion at the station had brought tears, relief, and quiet laughter, but for the officer, the evening was far from over. Even as he stepped outside into the cool night air, his mind replayed the events that had unfolded. He thought about the little girl, her silent fear, and the way she had clung to him during the tense moments. He thought about the driver, who had tried to hide the truth and almost succeeded if not for a keen eye and careful observation. The officer knew that what had happened tonight wasn't just about following procedure or doing a routine patrol. It was about noticing the small signs, trusting his instincts, and staying patient. Every detail mattered, from the nervous glance of the driver to the faint mark on the girl's wrist, from her silent eyes to the slight nod she gave when she finally felt safe. Each moment had built on the next until the outcome became clear. He walked slowly back to his patrol car, the city lights reflecting off the asphalt. The quiet hum of the night felt different now. It wasn't ordinary anymore. It carried the weight of what had been saved. He looked at the child's parents, still holding her tightly through the glass of the station's waiting room, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. In that moment, he understood what it meant to make a difference. Inside the station, other officers were finishing up the paperwork, reporting details to the central office, and making calls to ensure that the little girl would be placed safely with her parents. The first officer knew that there would be follow-ups, interviews, statements, and possibly court proceedings. But none of that mattered at the moment. What mattered was that the child was safe, her family was reunited, and justice had begun to take its course. He glanced again toward the little girl. She was now calmer, holding her mother's hand and occasionally looking up with a shy smile. It was small, but it was genuine. Her father rested a protective hand on her shoulder, occasionally brushing a strand of hair from her face. The scene was filled with a quiet warmth, the kind of warmth that reassured him that even after darkness, light could always return. The officer took a deep breath and reflected on the journey that had led him here. A simple traffic stop could have been a routine, unremarkable moment. But the smallest signs, slight changes in behavior, small visual cues, and gut instincts had transformed this routine into a rescue. It reminded him why he had chosen this job, why vigilance and attention to detail were more than just training. They were lifelines for those who couldn't protect themselves. He also thought about the fragility of trust. The girl had been in the care of someone she didn't know, someone who meant her harm. Her trust had been betrayed, and yet, in a matter of minutes, it had begun to rebuild. She trusted the officers because they showed calm, care, and patience. Trust, he realized, could be nurtured slowly, but it could also be broken in a second. Protecting that trust was as important as protecting life itself. The driver's arrest was now complete, and he would face the consequences of his actions. But for the officer, the focus remained on the girl and her family. It wasn't about punishment. It was about safety, healing, and ensuring that this child would never feel that fear again. Outside the station, the night had grown quieter. The hum of the city had slowed, and the cool air was calm and steady. The officer leaned against his car for a moment, looking up at the stars, thinking about how small choices could change lives. A glance, a pause, a careful question, all had led to this moment where a family was whole again. He knew there would be stories about this day, but the most important story was not about him or the arrest. It was about the little girl who had been found, the way she had clung to life even in fear, and the parents who would never forget the moment they held her again. That was the story that mattered, the one that would linger in the hearts of everyone involved. The officer finally started his car, the engine's quiet rumble filling the empty street. As he drove back onto the highway, he kept thinking about vigilance, humanity, and compassion. Every person he met, every decision he made could ripple through lives in ways he might never fully see. Tonight had reminded him of that in the most profound and human way possible. He glanced in the rearview mirror, remembering the little girl's wide, fearful eyes when he first saw her. He remembered the marks on her wrist, the silent plea she had carried, and the slow, cautious steps she took toward trust and safety. And he knew he would carry that memory with him forever. The night stretched on, dark and calm, but the weight of what had been accomplished filled him with quiet pride. He had seen fear, danger, and uncertainty, and he had acted. A life had been saved, a family reunited, and in the end, that was what mattered more than anything else. The highway seemed empty now, but the officer drove with purpose. Each mile reminded him of responsibility, of awareness, and of the small acts that could save someone's world. Tonight was proof that one person's careful attention could make the difference between despair and hope. As he turned off the highway onto familiar streets, he thought about the little girl, now safely home with her parents, finally able to sleep without fear, and he thought about the future, and how many more moments like this might come, moments where vigilance, patience, and human care could change everything. For the officer, this was more than a night on duty. It was a reminder of why he had chosen this path, why he believed in doing what was right even when it seemed small, and why every life, no matter how young, mattered. He drove on quietly, carrying the memory of those eyes, those small hands, and the knowledge that sometimes one ordinary evening could turn into a life-changing story of courage, care, and hope. And in that quiet night he knew that while the danger had passed, the lessons would stay with him forever.